They put a price on her like she was livestock. 22 years old, standing in the middle of Harlan's general store while her father haggled over her future like he was selling a mule that had gotten too expensive to feed. Every person in Coldwater Bluff watched. Some turned away. Most didn't. And Lydia Holloway stood there in her worn Sunday dress, hands clasped so tight her knuckles had gone white, telling herself she would not cry. Not here, not in front of these people, not ever again. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when a woman is sold, not in chains, not in a market, but in a small Montana town on a Tuesday afternoon, it looks exactly like this. It looks ordinary. That's the part that stays with you. This is her story. Stay until the end. If this reaches you, hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Lydia Holloway was sold, the sky over Coldwater Bluff was the color of old pewter, heavy and low. The kind of sky that pressed down on everything beneath it like it had somewhere better to be and resented being stuck here. She had woken before dawn, the same as always, had pulled on her dress in the dark, had gone out to the yard to draw water from the well before her father was up and looking for reasons. That was how she had learned to live. Quietly, carefully, always one step ahead of his mood. Check the sky before he checked it. Have the coffee hot before he asked for it. Stay small. Stay useful. Stay out of the path of whatever was building behind his eyes on any given morning. Gideon Holloway was not a man who'd been broken by hard luck. He was a man who'd been made by it into something meaner than he'd started. Lydia had heard the story enough times. The failed cattle drives, the banker who cheated him, the drought that took 3 seasons of work in a single summer. She'd heard it so many times the words had stopped meaning anything. What they meant to her now was just this. She was what he had left, and when a man like Gideon ran out of options, he started looking at what he owned. He told her the night before. Not sat her down, not tried to soften it, just said it over supper like he was announcing the weather. "You're getting married." She'd looked up from her plate. "What?" "Sawyer Creed, rancher up in the Absarokas. He's got land and he's got cash and I've got debts that need settling." He'd said it flat, without apology, already turning back to his food. "We're going into town tomorrow. You'll meet him there." Lydia had not slept. She'd lain on her back in the dark, staring at the ceiling with its water stains and its slow drip from the corner, and she'd thought about running. She'd thought about it the way people think about things they know they won't do. Turning it over, examining it, setting it down. Where would she go? She had $3 hidden in the lining of her winter coat. She knew nobody beyond Coldwater Bluff who would take her in. She was 22 years old, and she had spent so many years inside the radius of her father's control that the world outside it had started to feel like something from a story rather than a real place she could put her feet. So she hadn't run. She'd gotten up in the dark and drawn the water and made the coffee and stood now at the edge of the road outside Harlan's general store, watching a man she had never met in her life discuss the terms of her future. Sawyer Creed was not what she'd expected. She didn't know what she'd expected exactly. Something worse, probably. Something that matched the shape of what was happening. A man with small eyes and a mean mouth, maybe. Or one of those older ranchers who walked around with the particular arrogance of someone who had always gotten what he wanted from the world. She'd braced herself for that. What she got was a man in his middle 30s, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, wearing a coat that had seen a lot of weather. He was standing a little apart from her father, hat in his hands, and he was not looking at Gideon while Gideon talked. He was looking at her, not the way men usually looked at her. That quick assessment, that inventory. He was looking at her the way you look at someone when you're trying to figure out if they're all right. Like he was the one who owed her something, not the other way around. That small thing confused her enough that she almost missed the rest of it. "And the debt gets cleared in full," Gideon was saying. $240, we said. "She's a hard worker, keeps a clean house. You're not getting cheated." Sawyer's jaw moved. He looked back at Gideon and said, "I didn't say anything about cheating. I'm just telling you what you're getting." "I heard you." There was a silence between them that Lydia couldn't read. Around them, the street held its breath. Old man Harlan had come to stand in his doorway. The blacksmith's wife, Ruth Pritchard, was pretending to examine something in her basket. 2 men outside the saloon had turned around to watch. Nobody in Coldwater Bluff was going to miss this. Lydia felt the heat come up her neck. She had told herself she wouldn't, but she felt it anyway. That particular shame, the kind that has nothing to do with what you've done and everything to do with how you're being treated. Like being handled, like being talked about in the third person while you're standing right there. She looked at the ground, counted the dust between her boot toes, kept her face still. Fine, Sawyer said. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, handed it to Gideon without ceremony, without looking at him again. Then he turned to Lydia and he said quietly, "Miss Holloway, my wagon's across the street. Whenever you're ready." She looked up. His face was plain, not unkind. He had a scar along his left jaw, old and thin. He was watching her with that same look, careful, waiting, like he understood that he was asking something of her and he knew it. "I have a bag," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she'd wanted. "I'll get it." He turned to her father. "Which horse?" Gideon pointed toward the hitching post without interest. He was already looking at the envelope in his hands. Lydia watched her father count the money. She watched him wet his thumb and flip through the bills. He did not look at her, not once. When he was satisfied with the count, he folded the envelope and put it in his pocket and turned back toward the saloon, like a man who had finished a transaction at the feed store and had other things to get to. He didn't say goodbye. She had known he wouldn't. She'd known that for years. But knowing a thing and experiencing it are two separate countries, and standing in the dust of that road, watching her father's back disappear through the saloon door, she felt something in her chest that she could not have named. Not grief, exactly. Not anymore. Something older and heavier and tired. Sawyer came back with her bag. He set it in the wagon bed with more care than the bag warranted. It was a battered old traveling case that had once belonged to her mother, and she kept it patched with whatever she had. And then he looked at her and waited. "You don't have to do this today," he said. She blinked. "What?" "The ride up to the ranch. It's 2 days by wagon. We could stay at the boarding house tonight, give you time to—" He paused. "I don't know. Whatever you need." She didn't know what to say to that. People in her experience did not offer her time. Time was a resource her father had always controlled, always allocated, always used as leverage. "I'd rather go," she said. "Today." He nodded, once, and moved to help her up onto the wagon seat. His hand under her elbow was brief, practical, and then gone. They left Coldwater Bluff without ceremony. Nobody waved them off. The pewter sky held its color all the way out of town. Bulch. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. That was fine with Lydia. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the landscape change as the flatlands gave way to the beginning of the foothills. The grass going from brittle and yellow to something greener as the elevation climbed, the pine trees starting to show themselves on the ridgelines above. She had not been north of Coldwater Bluff in years. She'd forgotten there was this much sky. Sawyer drove with ease, handling the team with quiet competence, not fighting the horses, not shouting at them. The road was rough and rutted, and he slowed when it needed slowing and gave the horses their heads on the grades. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just doing the work. She studied him without making it obvious. It was an old habit, learning a person's patterns before they learned yours, figuring out what made them angry before they had a chance to show you. She watched for the signs she knew, the set of the shoulders, the angle of the jaw, the particular stillness that preceded something bad. She'd spent most of her life getting very good at reading those signs. She couldn't read him. That made her more nervous than if she'd found something frightening. "How far is the ranch?" she asked finally, because the silence was starting to press on her in a different way than she'd expected. "End of the second day," he said. "There's a river crossing about midway through tomorrow. If the water's low, it's easy. If it's not—" He shrugged. "We manage." "Have you made this trip many times?" "Enough. Not unfriendly, just not expansive." She cataloged that. "You live alone up there?" He glanced at her. "Have." "There's a woman who comes to help with the house twice a week, Agnes Beaumont. She lives 2 miles down the ridge. Her husband works a claim up near the pass. She's—" He seemed to consider his words. "She's decent. She'll be glad to have another woman around." Lydia absorbed this. "You told her about me. Told her I was getting married. And she didn't—" She stopped herself. "Didn't what?" "Nothing." He let that go for a moment, then said, "You can say what you're thinking. I'm not going to... He didn't finish the sentence either. I'm just telling you that she's decent. I was going to say she didn't think it was strange. The arrangement. Sawyer was quiet for a beat. She thought it was strange. Despite everything, something moved in Lydia's face. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. But she's not the type to say much about it, he continued. She minds her own. The road bent upward and he guided the horses into the grade. The pine smell got stronger. A crow called somewhere in the trees and was answered by another farther away. Mr. Creed, Lydia said. Sawyer. Sawyer. The name felt odd in her mouth, the way a new word does before you've worn it in. I want to be clear about something. All right. I don't know you. I don't know anything about you except what my father told me, which was almost nothing, and what I saw this morning. She kept her voice even. This was important to get right. I understand the arrangement. I understand what you paid and what that means, but I need you to understand that I'm not... She searched for the right word. I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not just because you bought the right to expect it. The horse's feet clopped against the road. The wagon creaked. That's fair, Sawyer said. I'll keep the house and do my part. I'll work. I'm not afraid of work, but I won't be afraid of you. He didn't look at her. I wouldn't want you to be. Most men would. Maybe. Don't just say what sounds right, she said, sharper than she'd meant. I've had years of people saying what sounds right. He did look at her then, brief but direct. I know, he said. She didn't know what he meant by that. She filed it away. They made camp that first night in a hollow between two ridges where a creek came down out of the rocks. Sawyer built the fire without asking her to help, then turned and said, You cook or you want me to? She raised an eyebrow. You cook? Better than some. She let him do it, partly because she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the miles, and partly because she wanted to see what he did when he didn't think he needed to perform anything. That was when you learned who a person was, not in the arrangements or the courtesies, but in the in-between moments. He made something from dried beans and salt pork and a handful of dried herbs he kept in a little cloth pouch. It wasn't fancy. It was good. He handed her a bowl without ceremony and sat across the fire with his own. They ate. The fire popped. Somewhere in the dark above them, an owl was hunting. How'd you end up owing my father money? She asked. She hadn't planned to ask it, but it came out. Sawyer glanced up. I didn't. She set down her spoon. He said you had a debt arrangement. That was his word for it. I paid him for the marriage contract. That's different from a debt. He turned the spoon over in his fingers. Your father went to a man I know in Billings looking to sell the contract to someone. My name came up. I made the trip to Coldwater Bluff. Why? He looked into the fire. The light moved across the scar on his jaw. I knew your name, he said. What does that mean? It means I knew your name before that man in Billings ever mentioned it. He said it quietly, like he was being careful with something. It means this wasn't chance. Lydia stared at him across the fire. The flames threw shadows up his face and then pulled them back. In the dark beyond the firelight, the Montana wilderness went on for what felt like forever in every direction. I don't understand, she said. I know. He set down his bowl and looked at her. I'm not trying to be mysterious. There's a thing I need to tell you, and I've been thinking since this morning about how to say it without... He stopped, started again, without it sounding like something it's not. Then say it plainly. He was quiet for a moment. We've met before, he said. You wouldn't remember. You were a child. About 7 or 8, I'd say, if I'm counting right. The fire crackled. Lydia said nothing. I was younger than that, maybe 6. Things were bad at home. I'd been going days without eating. I was sitting outside the Mercantile in Coldwater Bluff, and you came by with a biscuit from somewhere, and you gave it to me. He said it flat, without drama. You didn't have to. I wasn't asking. You just looked at me and gave it to me and said something. What did I say? You said you were sorry I was hungry. The fire made its small noises. A spark drifted up and went out. That's all, he said. You probably forgot it before you got home, but I've been carrying it ever since. Lydia sat very still. She did not reach for the memory. She was afraid to. afraid of what it might mean if it was there, and afraid of what it meant if it wasn't. She was a child, he'd said. She'd been 7 or 8, which meant she wouldn't have understood what she was doing, probably just that someone looked hungry and she had something to give. That's why you... She couldn't finish the sentence either, apparently. I kept track of you from a distance. I heard about your mother passing, heard about how things were in your house. His voice was steady, but something in it had gotten heavier. I started making plans a long time ago. I didn't know when or how, just that if a door ever opened... He looked up at her. I was going to walk through it. The owl called again, twice, and then the night went quiet. That's... Lydia tried to find the word. That's a great deal to carry. Yes. You don't know me. I know that. You knew a child, a moment. That's not a person. No, he said. It's not. He picked up his bowl again, as if the weight of what he'd just said could be balanced by something as ordinary as eating. I don't expect you to know what to do with that. I'm not sure I know what to do with it either. He shook his head. I didn't want to get there and have you think this was just a transaction, because it wasn't. Not for me. Lydia looked at him for a long time. She had been sold that morning. She had stood in the street and watched her father take money for her future and walk away without looking back. She had gotten into a wagon with a stranger and ridden half a day into country she didn't know. She was tired in her bones and raw in places she didn't want to examine, and she had no idea what her life looked like from here. And now this man, this stranger, with the weathered coat and the old scar and the bowl of beans, was telling her that he had been carrying a biscuit and an act of kindness in his chest for 15 years. She didn't know if it was beautiful or terrifying. Maybe both. All right, she said at last. I hear you. That's enough for now, he said. She believed him when he said it, which surprised her more than any of it. The second day was longer. They crossed 3 creeks and 1 shallow river, the water brown and quick with the early autumn snowmelt coming down from the high country. At the river crossing, Sawyer walked ahead of the team to check the bottom, and then came back and told her what they were going to do, step by step, and asked her if she was ready. Nobody had ever asked her that before. Not the way he did it. Like the answer actually changed what happened next. Ready, she said. They crossed. The country got wilder and more beautiful the higher they climbed. Lydia had thought she knew Montana. She'd lived in its territory her whole life, but she'd lived in the low flat part, the settled part, the part that had been worked down and fenced off and argued over. This was something else. The aspen were turning at altitude, the leaves going gold and quaking in whatever small wind came down from the peaks. The pines were enormous here, old-growth trees that had never been touched by anything except weather, their roots working down through the rock. Ravens circled over something on a ridge to the west. She found herself wanting to ask him questions, and then stopping herself before she did, not sure why. Some instinct that said wanting things was dangerous, that showing interest was showing softness, and softness was what people used against you. But at midday, when they stopped to water the horses at a spring that came out of a cliff face in a thin, bright curtain, she stood at the edge of the trees and looked out over the valley below. Miles and miles of it, the afternoon light making it golden, and she couldn't help it. "Is this yours?" she asked. He came to stand beside her, not too close. "Some of it. The bench above the valley and up to that ridge east," he pointed. "The south boundary's the river we crossed this morning." "How much?" "About 600 acres. I've been adding to it." She looked at the valley. There was a quality to the light here she hadn't seen before. A particular kind of clean, the way air tastes after rain, except constant. "It's not what I pictured," she said. "What did you picture?" She turned to look at him. He was watching the valley too, not her, and there was something in his face then, a kind of peace that was different from the careful watchfulness he'd been wearing since Coldwater Bluff. He looked like a man who was home. "I don't know exactly," she said honestly. "Harder, more..." She searched for the word. "Defeated, maybe." He glanced at her. "I thought a man who bought a wife would need something desperate," she said. "I thought the place would look that way too." He was quiet for a moment, then, "It's been hard. It didn't start like this. But no, not defeated." He looked back at the valley. "I wanted it to be a place worth coming to." She heard what he didn't say, a place worth bringing her to. And she didn't know what to do with that, so she filed it with the other things she didn't know what to do with and turned back toward the wagon. But they reached the ranch in the last light. It was tucked into the mountain's shoulder like it had been set there with care, a main house of squared timber with a covered porch running the full front length, a barn that was solid and well kept, a paddock, a chicken coop, and beyond the barn a kitchen garden that had gone to end-of-season rust and gold in the cooling September air. There were roses. She saw them as they came up the track. 3 bushes planted along the south side of the porch, unpruned and rangy but flowering still, late roses, the kind that hung on into cold weather. She did not know why that stopped her breath. Sawyer brought the wagon to rest in the yard and climbed down, and when he turned to help her down, she was still looking at the roses. "Agnes put those in," he said. "I told her—" He stopped. "What did you tell her?" He was quiet for a beat. "I told her that the woman coming might like flowers." Lydia stood in the wagon, looking at the roses, and she felt something move in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. Not happiness. She was too guarded and too tired and too much the daughter of Gideon Holloway to open up that fast. But something adjacent to it. Something like the first very small pressure of a door that has been closed a long time. "Did you know that?" she asked. "That I like them?" "No," he said honestly. "I was guessing." She climbed down. The house was clean. More than clean. It was deliberately arranged, the kind of space someone has thought about and prepared. There was a rocking chair by the window with a good angle for light. There were extra quilts on the chest at the foot of the bed. The kitchen had been stocked recently. She could tell by the arrangement of things, the careful order that had a self-conscious quality, the kind of tidiness that comes from wanting to make a good impression. He had prepared all of this before she arrived, probably weeks before. She stood in the middle of the main room and looked around at it and tried to decide how she felt. Sawyer set her bag down near the bedroom door and stood with his hat in his hands, waiting. He did that a lot, she'd noticed. Waited for her to land on her own conclusions, rather than trying to direct her toward them. "Your room's through there," he said. "I'll be in the loft." When she turned to look at him, he met her eyes and said simply, "I meant what I said last night. You're here because you chose to be here. Nothing changes that." She looked at him for a long moment. "You couldn't have known I'd choose," she said. "Last night, I mean. You paid my father before you knew anything about me." "No," he said. "I couldn't know." "Then what if I'd been—" She struggled with how to put it. "What if I'd been someone different, mean, ungrateful? What if I'd hated it here?" He considered this with what appeared to be genuine seriousness. "Then I reckon we'd have figured out something else," he said. "But I had a feeling. About me." "About who you might have grown into," he said. "A person who hands a biscuit to a hungry child because she doesn't like to see suffering. That's not the kind of person who disappears by the time they're grown." Lydia felt the words go through her somewhere. Not comforting, exactly. More like something landing true, and true things have an impact, even the gentle ones. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't." She turned and looked at the room again, at the quilts and the rocking chair and the good angle for light. "I'll need things to do," she said. "I can't just sit. Ranch has plenty of need for that. I want to learn it, the actual work, not just the house." He nodded. "I'll teach you what I know." She picked up her bag. She stood at the bedroom door for a moment without turning around. "Thank you," she said, "for the roses." "They're not much," he said. "They're late in the season." "There's something," she said, and went inside. That first night she lay in the bed he'd prepared, and she listened to the mountain. The wind through the pines had a sound she didn't know. Not threatening, just enormous. The sound of something too large and old to be concerned with human worries. In the distance, a coyote called, once, and then the silence came back deeper than before. She thought about what he'd said. 15 years, a biscuit, a child's careless kindness, the kind given without thought, without expectation, and somehow it had traveled all this way through time and landed her here, in this bed, in this mountain, in this life she had not chosen but had not been able to avoid. She thought about her father counting money in the street and not looking back, She thought about the roses, late in the season, still holding on. She was not safe yet. She knew that. Safety was not something you arrived at in a single wagon ride. It was something you built from 1,000 small tests, and she had not run enough of those tests yet to know what this place was, what this man was, what her life was going to look like from here. But she was not afraid tonight. That was strange enough to notice. She was not afraid. She lay in the dark, and she listened to the mountain breathe, and somewhere in the middle of that listening, without quite meaning to, she fell asleep. Outside, the late roses bent in the wind and held. She was up before him the next morning. Old habit, the kind that doesn't break just because the circumstances change. Lydia was dressed and had the stove going before the light outside had gotten past gray, standing in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a tin cup, listening to the ranch wake up around her. The horses moved in the paddock. Something small rustled in the eaves above the porch. The wind had dropped overnight and the mountain sat very still in the early cold. The kind of stillness that has weight to it, that presses against the windows like it wants to come inside and warm itself. She heard him move in the loft above, boots on the ladder rungs. He came down already dressed, which told her he was also a person who didn't linger in bed past use, and he stopped at the bottom of the ladder when he saw the stove going and the coffee on, and something crossed his face that he didn't say anything about. "You didn't have to," he said. "I was up anyway." He nodded and came to the kitchen and poured himself a cup and stood at the window looking out at the yard, the same way she'd been doing, both of them separately watching the morning settle into the valley below. It wasn't uncomfortable. That was the thing she noticed. The silence between them wasn't a loaded silence, wasn't the kind she'd grown up with, where quiet meant something bad was collecting. It was just two people standing in a kitchen before the day started. She was not ready to trust that yet, but she noticed it. "I want to see the whole property today," she said. "If you're not against it." He turned from the window. "We can do that. I need to check the north fence line anyway. Some of the posts were rotting when I left. Been about 2 weeks." "You were in town for 2 weeks?" Needed to be sure everything was settled before... He stopped. Before the trip. Before coming to get her. He'd spent 2 weeks making sure his arrangements were in order before riding down to Coldwater Bluff to buy her from her father. She turned that over in her mind and didn't say anything about it, just finished her coffee and rinsed the cup and went to find her coat. The fence line was a long walk north along the ridge, the ground rising steeply enough in places that she had to use her hands on the rocks to keep her footing. Sawyer didn't slow down for her, and she didn't ask him to, and after the first 20 minutes, she realized he wasn't testing her. He just walked the way he walked, and he'd trusted her to keep up or not. That was different from what she was used to. Men either condescended or ignored. They didn't simply assume competence and move on. She found herself working harder just to meet the assumption. The fence needed more than he'd expected. 4 posts were down completely, a 5th leaning at a useless angle, and something, deer most likely, he said, had pushed through the wire in 2 places. He had a repair kit in the saddlebag he'd brought up on the gray horse, fencing pliers and wire, and a mallet, and he worked methodically, not hurrying, explaining what he was doing as he went without making it a lesson. "Hand me that length there," he said at one point. And she did, and he said thank you, without thinking about it, the automatic courtesy of a person who says it whether or not anyone's watching, and she noted that too and filed it. They worked until midday. Her hands got dirty, and one of the wire ends caught her forearm and left a thin red line, and she wrapped it with the corner of her kerchief and kept going. He saw it happen and looked at her, and she said, "I'm fine," and he said, "All right," and that was the end of it. No fuss, no suggestion that she ought to go sit down somewhere, just all right. At noon they ate sitting on the rock with the valley spread below them, dried meat and hard biscuit from what he'd packed, and the air up here had a quality that made even plain food taste like something worth having. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. "How you started it." He chewed and thought about it. "Came up here 7 years ago. Had enough saved to buy the land, but not much else. First winter I lived in the barn." "In the barn? House wasn't built yet." He said it without apology, just fact. "I'd gotten the frame up before the snow hit, but the walls weren't in. So I wintered with the horses. 2 of them. They were good company." She tried to picture it. A man spending a Montana winter in a barn by choice or by necessity, which amounted to the same thing. "Where did you come from, before here, or around?" He looked out at the valley. I worked cattle drives out of Texas for 3 years. Before that, I was in Wyoming, mining operation. Didn't care for it. Before that, he paused. Wherever I could find work. Since when? He looked at her sideways. Since I was about 11. She was quiet. 11. She did the math without wanting to. If he was 6 when she'd given him a biscuit, then 5 years later he'd been on his own, working. She knew what that meant, knew the kind of childhood that produced it, because she'd had her own version of one, even with a roof overhead. Your people? She asked, careful. Father drank himself to death when I was 10. Mother had gone before that. There were 4 of us kids. I was the oldest. The younger 3 went to different families in the county. I didn't want to go to any of them, so I didn't. He said it in the same tone he'd been using to discuss fence posts. Like it was terrain, something you navigated, not something you felt. You do what you have to. And you ended up here. Eventually, he picked up his biscuit again. Took long enough. She sat with all of that for a moment. 6 years old and hungry outside a mercantile. 10 years old and losing the last of whatever held his world together. 11 and already working for strangers. And then 30 years of that, years of cattle drives and mining camps and cold winters, pointed toward this valley, this bench of land, these roses planted along a porch for a woman he didn't know. Sawyer, she said. Yeah, last night you said you'd kept track of me. She was watching his face. What does that mean exactly? I want to understand. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, I came back through Coldwater Bluff twice, maybe 3 times over the years. Not for you specifically, just passing through. But I looked, heard things. He folded the cloth he'd had his food wrapped in. Heard your mother passed when you were 14. Heard your father remarried and that didn't last. Heard he was drinking and the farm was going under. He stopped. I heard enough. Enough to decide. Enough to start setting something aside. Saving toward something that might never happen. He looked at her directly then, and there was a discomfort in his face that she thought was honesty. The look of a person saying something that doesn't flatter him. I want to be straight with you. Some of it was, I wanted to help. That was real, but some of it was... He stopped again. Say it, she said. Some of it was that I'd built something up in my head over 15 years and I wanted... He rubbed his jaw. I wanted it to be real, not just something I carried around. And that's not the same thing as purely wanting to help somebody. That's wanting something for yourself, and I know the difference. Lydia looked at him. The valley below threw back the afternoon light in long gold angles. At least you know the difference, she said. Doesn't make it right. No, she agreed, but it's more honest than most men get. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the valley. I'm not trying to make you grateful. I want to say that plainly. Whatever happened before, the debt, your father, all of it, that's done. I don't want it held over anything. She thought about that. You paid $240 for me. I paid $240 to get you out, he said, and the distinction in his voice was quiet but definite. That's different. She was not ready to agree with that. It was the same money, the same transaction, the same street in Coldwater Bluff, but she heard the way he meant it and filed it alongside the rest of what she was still sorting through. They went back down to the ranch in the middle of the afternoon. She helped him with the horses and he showed her without making a production of it, where the feed was kept, how much, how to read whether an animal was off. She had always been decent with horses. Her father had kept 2 and she'd tended them since she was small. Sawyer's 2 were better kept than anything her father had owned, their hooves clean, their coats not too thin going into the colder months. You take care of them, she said. They work hard. Seems fair. It was such a simple thing to say. Such a simple principle. She had lived most of her life around a man who believed that things that worked hard for him owed him their effort and more, that debt ran one direction and gratitude ran none. The simplicity of fare struck her somewhere sore. Agnes Beaumont came the next morning. She was a stout woman, somewhere in her 50s, dark-haired going gray at the temples, with a face that had done a lot of weather and a pair of sharp brown eyes that took Lydia in completely in about 4 seconds, came to some conclusion, and didn't share it. You're Lydia, she said, not a question. Yes, ma'am. You look tired. She set down her basket on the kitchen table. Sit down, I'll make something. I didn't ask what you needed. She was already at the stove. Sit. Lydia sat. There was something about Agnes that made argument feel like a waste of time. Sawyer had made himself scarce. Lydia suspected he'd timed his trip to the barn carefully. And so it was just the two of them in the kitchen while Agnes made some kind of corn porridge from what she'd brought in her basket, moving around the space with the authority of a woman who had been in it many times before. "He tell you about the house?" Agnes said, with her back to Lydia. "What about it?" "He spent 6 weeks getting it ready, before you came." She stirred without looking up, changed the window in the bedroom so it faced east, said whoever was coming would want morning light. Lydia looked toward the bedroom door, the window. She had woken to good light and had simply accepted it as luck. "He told me he didn't know me," she said slowly. "He didn't," Agnes said. "But he had notions." She turned around and put a bowl on the table and sat down across from Lydia with her own cup of coffee, wrapping both hands around it. "I want to tell you something." "All right? I think he's a good man. I'm not saying that because I'm supposed to. I'm saying it because I've known him 4 years and I've seen what he's like when nobody's watching, which is the only version of a person that matters." She looked at Lydia steadily. "But I also think you've had a time of it, and I think you're sitting here trying to figure out what's real and what isn't, and that's sensible. That's the right thing to be doing." Lydia was quiet. "I'm just saying, don't let the bad years make you slow to see something different when it's actually in front of you," Agnes said. "Not quickly. I'm not telling you to trust him overnight. I'm telling you to let your eyes work." "You're direct," Lydia said. "Life's short, and I'm 53. Agnes drank her coffee. "How are your hands?" Lydia looked down. The wire cut had scabbed over. Her palms were roughened already from the fence work. "Fine." Agnes nodded like this satisfied her. "He'll work you hard if you let him, not because he's mean, because he doesn't know any other speed. You'll have to tell him when to stop." "I'm not afraid of work." "I can see that." Agnes looked at her for another beat. "What are you afraid of?" The question landed without warning, and Lydia had no answer ready, which was its own answer. "That's all right," Agnes said, not unkindly. "You don't have to know yet." Over the following days, the ranch took shape around Lydia, the way new places do. First as a collection of separate things, then gradually as a whole, a place with its own logic and rhythm that she began to learn the way you learn a language. Slowly, by immersion, making mistakes that didn't kill her. She learned the chickens by temperament. Which ones would take grain from her hand, which one would peck if she moved too fast. The old brown one in the back that was half blind and needed the feed put directly in front of her. She learned the kitchen garden's leftovers, the late cabbages that had survived the frost, the dried herb bundles Agnes had hung from the rafters. She learned the particular way the wind changed before weather came, a shift in the smell of it first, then the color of the sky going from blue to something with more green in it, which meant rain was coming off the mountains. She learned Sawyer in the same incremental way. He was up early and to bed early. He was not a man who talked to fill silence. When he spoke, it was because he had something to say, and when he didn't, he didn't. He had a habit, she noticed, of stopping what he was doing when she spoke to him. Not dramatically, just a small arrest of motion, attention shifting fully. Most people in her experience talked to you while continuing whatever else they were doing, hands still moving, eyes elsewhere. He put things down. She didn't know if that was a practice thing or a natural one. She didn't ask. She just noticed it. One afternoon she found it. The box. She hadn't been searching. She'd been looking for an extra lantern chimney that Sawyer had mentioned was somewhere in the back of the storage room, and she'd pulled out a crate and behind it found a smaller wooden box, unlocked, the kind you use for papers or valuables. She would have put it aside and kept looking, except that on the inside of the lid, visible when she accidentally knocked it open, there was a piece of paper folded and worn at the creases. She should have closed it. She knew that. She closed the lid most of the way, and then she opened it again because she was her father's daughter. In at least one respect, she had learned early that ignorance was not protection. The paper was a list. Old paper, the kind that had been handled many times. The writing on it was plain and functional, not elegant. At the top it said, "Things needed for a house if a woman is living in it." Below that, in careful columns, were items. A rocking chair with good armrests, Extra quilts, at least 4, wool if possible, a window with morning light in the main bedroom, shelves in the kitchen at a good height, not too high, rose bushes if the ground will take them, herbs for cooking, a mirror in the main room not too small. She stood in the storage room with the list in her hands and she read it through twice. It was not dated. It could have been from a year ago or 4 years ago or 7. The paper had that color that comes from being refolded and unfolded so many times it starts to go soft at the creases. And she thought about what that meant. What it meant to have a list like this and take it out and look at it and put it back away and take it out again over however many years, adding to it, revising it. A list made for her, not for a wife in the abstract, for her specifically, or for what she'd represented to him. The possibility of her, the idea of her, a girl who had stopped on a street and seen a hungry child. She folded it carefully along its existing creases and put it back in the box and pushed the box back behind the crate and found the lantern chimney and went back to the kitchen. She didn't say anything about it at supper. She made the meal, venison and the last of the late cabbages, and they ate and talked about the north pasture and the weather coming in, and she watched him across the table and tried to reconcile the man in front of her with the boy who had carried a biscuit for 15 years. "You've been quiet," he said. "I'm always quiet." Quieter than usual. She looked at him. He had that attention again. Things set down, watching her. "I found the box," she said, "in the storage room. I wasn't going through your things. I was looking for the lantern chimney." He was still for a moment. "Okay." The list. He looked down at his plate, then back up. He didn't pretend not to know what she was talking about. "How long have you had it?" she asked. 9 years, maybe, thereabouts. She sat with that. 9 years. She had been 13 years old, and in Coldwater Bluff navigating her father's grief turned mean. And somewhere in Wyoming or Texas or wherever he'd been, this man had been writing a list of things a house needed if a woman was going to live in it, specifically, carefully. She tried to find how to say it. "That's a very long time to carry something." "I know. Don't you think that's—" She searched. "Strange? To most people that would seem strange." "Probably," he said. "I know what it sounds like." "What does it sound like?" He put down his fork. "It sounds like I built a life around a stranger. And maybe I did, but that's not—" He rubbed his hand over the back of his neck. "The life I built is real. The ranch is real. The work is real. I wasn't waiting around staring at a wall. I was doing things, but underneath it there was—" He stopped. "There was a direction to all of it. Does that make sense? A direction. Somewhere I was going even when I didn't know exactly where or how." She thought about her own life and whether it had ever had a direction. All those years in her father's house, she'd been surviving. Not going anywhere, just holding on, making it to the next season. The idea of moving towards something deliberate across 9 years felt foreign and strange, and she wasn't sure if it moved her or unsettled her or both. "I don't know what to do with this," she said honestly. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "I told you because you found it and because I didn't want to pretend. Not because I want something from you for it." "You always say that." "I mean it." "I know," she said, and she was surprised to find that she did. She believed him, which was its own bewildering thing, and she sat with that for the rest of the meal and said nothing more about it, and he let her, and the night came down over the mountain with its particular weight and its coyotes in the far dark, and Lydia lay in her bed with the morning light window and thought about a boy making a list of what a home should hold. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with any of it, but for the first time in a long time, she was not entirely certain she wanted to stay behind the walls she'd built. They had kept her safe, those walls. She knew that, didn't discount it. But walls, she was starting to think, also kept things out. Things like whatever this was. Whatever it was becoming. She fell asleep with the question unresolved, which felt somehow less like failure than it used to. The snow came early that year. Agnes had warned them, said the elk were moving down from the high country 2 weeks ahead of schedule, said the way the aspens had dropped their leaves all at once, instead of gradual, meant the mountain was preparing for something serious. Sawyer had listened and spent 3 days before the first real cold stacking firewood against the side of the house until the pile ran the full length of the porch and up past the railing. Lydia had helped without being asked, carrying and stacking, her breath coming out in clouds, and they'd worked side by side in the gray October chill without talking much, which was becoming their particular way of being together, comfortable in the shared labor, not needing to fill it. The first storm came on a Tuesday and lasted 2 days and was not the serious one. Just a warning. 8 inches on the level, enough to make the yard unfamiliar, enough to keep them closer to the house than the range, but manageable. They got through it without difficulty, and she thought, all right, this is winter, and I can do this. The serious one came 3 weeks later. She woke in the night to a sound she didn't know. Not the usual wind, not the mountain's ordinary breathing, but something lower and more sustained. A pressure rather than a sound, like the air itself was being pushed against the house from every side at once. She lay still and listened, and her body told her, the way bodies do when something is genuinely wrong, that this was different. She got up and went to the window and could not see anything. Not the barn, not the fence, not the tree line 20 yards off. White and moving, completely featureless. The kind of storm that erases the world. Sawyer was already up. She could hear him moving below. The loft ladder, the creak of the main room floor. She pulled on her coat over her nightdress and came out and found him at the front door with his hand on the latch, looking out through the gap at what was outside. "Don't," she said. He turned. He had that alert look, the one she'd come to recognize as his version of concern. Not panicked, just fully present. "The horses. They're in the barn. The barn is solid. The latch on the south door was loose. I meant to fix it last week and didn't." He said it flat, the way he said things that bothered him. "If that door comes open in this wind, then you can't help it now." She came to stand beside him and looked out through the gap. The cold hit her face like something physical. "You can't go out in that. You can't see 3 feet." He held the door a moment longer, looking out, and she could see him working through it. The arithmetic of risk, the pull of responsibility for the animals against the plain reality of what was outside that door. "Sawyer." She put her hand on his arm. First time she'd done that, she felt him register it. "I know," he said. He closed the door. They moved the 2 chairs near the stove and fed it and sat and listened to the storm work on the house. It was an old sound, that kind of weather against timber, groaning and popping, and the occasional sharp crack from somewhere in the walls as the wood responded to the cold. The fire made its own sounds against that. Between the two there was almost something like warmth, the functional kind, the kind that keeps you alive. "How long?" she asked. "This kind? Could be a day. Could be 3. He had his hands open toward the stove. "We've got food enough, wood enough. We'll be fine." She nodded. Outside the house shook and steadied and shook again. "Tell me about your mother," she said. He looked over at her. "You don't have to," she said. We've got time." He was quiet for a moment, watching the stove. "She was small," he said. "Red hair, louder than you'd expect from the size of her." A pause. "She laughed easily. That's the thing I remember most. She laughed at things my father couldn't see the humor in, which was most things. She'd find something funny in the middle of a bad situation and just laugh. Drove him half crazy." "What happened to her?" "Fever. I was 8. He said it the way you say things you've had a long time to get used to. She was sick 3 weeks, and then she wasn't there anymore. My father went the other direction after that. Whatever he'd been before, he went the other way." He stopped. "I think she was the thing that held him to something worth holding to. Without her, he just fell through." Lydia looked at her own hands. "My mother was quiet," she said. "The opposite. She got very still when things were bad, like if she didn't move, whatever it was might not notice her." She paused. "I used to think she was weak for it. I was a child. I didn't understand. Later I realized she'd run out of ways to fight, and she was trying to spend what she had left carefully." He didn't say anything, just listened. "My father wasn't always the way he is now," she said, and then stopped because that wasn't quite true. "Or maybe he was, and I just couldn't see it clearly when I was small. I used to think there was a version of him that was better, before the debt and the failures. Now I'm not sure the failures made him mean. I think the mean was always there. The failures just gave it permission." "That's a hard thing to conclude about your own father." "It's harder to keep pretending otherwise," she said. The storm threw something against the north wall. A branch, maybe, or just a concentrated gust hitting the timber, and they both looked up reflexively. The house held. The fire kept burning. "He hit you," Sawyer said. Not a question. She didn't answer right away. The fire moved in the stove. "Not always," she said. "Sometimes it was other things. The things he said. The way he could make you feel like you were nothing, like you were a problem he hadn't figured out how to solve yet." She looked at the stove. "The hitting was almost easier. At least that was finished when it was finished. The other kind, you'd carry it all day, all week." Sawyer's hands had gone still. "How long?" he said. "As long as I can remember." She said it quietly, not for sympathy. She'd learned to hate sympathy, the way it sat on you, the way it required you to manage other people's reactions to your own history. "It got worse after my mother died. I think he needed somewhere to put it, and I was what was there." The storm pressed on the house, and she sat in its noise and the fire's light, and did not feel for once that she needed to keep this particular door closed. There was something about the storm, maybe, the way it sealed them in together, the way there was nowhere to go, that made the ordinary barriers feel less necessary. Or maybe it was just that she was tired of maintaining them alone. "I'm sorry," Sawyer said. His voice was low. "You don't have to be sorry for it." "I know." He looked at her. "I'm saying it anyway." She met his eyes. The fire threw light across both of them, and outside the mountain was doing its worst, and inside the room was small and warm. And she looked at this man who had built a house for her before he knew her, and she said, because honesty was the only currency she had left that was worth anything, "I don't know what I'm doing here, Sawyer. I mean that literally. I don't know what this is supposed to be or what I'm supposed to feel or how any of this—" She gestured at the room, the house, the implied everything. "How any of this is real." "It doesn't have to be anything yet," he said. "You keep saying things like that." "Because I keep meaning them." She looked away. "You could have told me," she said, "about the box, the list, all of it. You could have told me on the first day." "Would you have believed me?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I'd have thought you were trying to manipulate me. That's why I waited." He shifted in the chair, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "I wasn't trying to hide it. I was trying to—" He stopped. "I wanted you to be able to see things for yourself before I told you what to think about them. Because I knew if I came at you with all of it at once, it would sound like a performance. It still sounds like a lot. I know it does." "It scares me," she said, and that was the truest thing she'd said, and she felt the admission like a cold draft, exposed. He was quiet for a moment. "What part?" "The part where someone wants something from me that much." She looked at him. "In my experience, that's always cost me something I didn't want to pay." Sawyer held her gaze. She watched something move through his face. Not hurt, exactly, but a kind of recognition, like she'd named something he'd been trying not to think about. "That's fair," he said, "and I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it plainly." "All right." "My motives were not entirely clean." He said it the way you say something you've decided has to be said. "I told you on the first night, I wanted to help you, but I also wanted something for myself. I'd built this up, this idea, this—" He shook his head. "I told myself the story enough times that I wasn't always sure where helping you ended and wanting you started. And I know that's a problem." Lydia watched him. The admission sat in the air between them. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "Doesn't make it better." "No, but it matters that you know it." She looked back at the fire. "Most men never get that far." The storm peaked somewhere around midnight, the kind of peak where you stop hearing individual gusts, and it becomes one sustained roar, the house reduced to an island in it. They moved their chairs a little closer to the stove, and at some point she fell asleep sitting up, the warmth and the exhaustion of the previous weeks finally collecting their due. She woke to find a blanket around her shoulders and Sawyer asleep in the other chair, his head against the back, his breathing slow and even. She sat very still so as not to wake him and looked at his face in the dying firelight. He looked younger asleep, the watchfulness gone from it. The scar along his jaw, his hands hanging open on the armrests, big, work-worn hands, the hands of someone who had been building things since he was old enough to lift a hammer. She thought about what he'd said, about his motives, the admission, the discomfort of saying it, And she thought about her own life and all the people who had never bothered to examine their motives at all, who had simply acted on whatever they wanted and called it right because they were the ones doing it. It was not uncomplicated. None of this was. But she was starting to think that uncomplicated might be the wrong thing to look for. She got up quietly and fed the stove and sat back down. They came on the second day of the blizzard. She heard the horses first, not the barn horses, different hooves, the sound of riders coming through heavy snow, which had a labored quality to it, the particular effort of animals being pushed through something they didn't want to cross. She was at the window before she'd thought about moving, and she could see them through the white. 3 riders coming up the track, hunched against the cold. She knew the shape of the man in front. Sawyer. Her voice came out flat, and she didn't mean it to. He was already awake. She thought maybe he'd been awake for a while. He came to the window and looked out, and she watched his face change, not into fear, into something older and quieter than fear. "Get your coat," he said. "That's my father." "I know." He was already moving to the door. "Get your coat and stay inside until I No. She said it before she knew she was going to. "No, I'm coming out." He stopped and looked at her. "This is my house," she said. The words surprised her when they came out. She hadn't thought them first. They'd just arrived, true and solid, the way true things do when you stop looking for them and they find you instead. "This is my house, and that is my father, and I'm not going to stand inside and listen to whatever happens next. I'm done with that." A muscle moved in Sawyer's jaw. He looked at her for one more beat, and then he nodded once and reached past her for his coat and held the door. The cold hit like a wall. The snow had led up to something manageable, still falling, but not the roar of the previous night, and she could see clearly enough. Gideon Holloway and 2 men she didn't know had pulled up short of the porch, their horses stamping and blowing in the cold. Gideon had a rifle across the saddle in front of him, comfortable and casual, the way a man carries a thing he's decided to use. He looked worse than the last time she'd seen him. Thinner through the face, something harder and more cornered in his eyes. She had seen that look before. It was the look he got when something hadn't gone the way he'd planned, and he'd decided someone else was the reason. "Lydia," he said. "Father. Come on down here." He said it the way he'd always said things, like the outcome was already settled, like her participation was a formality. She stood on the porch and didn't move. "I'm fine where I am." His jaw tightened. "I've got business with your husband." "Then say it from there." Gideon's eyes moved to Sawyer, standing a half step to her left, and something flickered in them. Calculation, she recognized it. He was reading the situation, looking for the angle. "The terms weren't honored," Gideon said. 240? We agreed. I've since learned the land up here is worth considerably more than what I settled for. I want what's fair." Sawyer's voice was even. "We agreed 240. You took 240. That's done." "The girl's worth more than that." The words hit her the way they always had, flat and without warmth, the inventory taking, the reduction. The girl. Like she was cargo that had been undervalued on a manifest. She felt the old familiar clench of it, the reflex to go small, to look at the ground, to let it pass over her and wait for it to be finished. She didn't do that. "I'm not worth anything, Father," she said. "That's the point you keep missing. I am not a thing you own. You never had the right to sell me, and whatever you took from this man was taken under false pretense because I was never yours to trade." Gideon stared at her. "You want to talk about terms?" she continued. "Let's talk about terms. 14 years of work in your house, cooking, cleaning, tending the farm, keeping everything running while you drank away whatever we had left. 14 years without wages, without thanks, without one single morning where I wasn't calculating how to stay out of the path of your mood." Her voice was shaking, but not from fear. She identified it as she spoke. It was anger, finally, the clean and righteous kind, the kind that had been sitting behind her sternum for so long she'd forgotten it was there. "If we're settling debts, I'd say you owe me considerably." The 2 men behind Gideon exchanged a look. Gideon's face had gone a particular red she knew well, the color that preceded his worst. "You watch your mouth," he said low. "I watched it for 22 years, she said. "I'm done watching it." Gideon's hand moved on the rifle. Sawyer took one step forward. Not aggressive, just present, putting himself into the geometry of it, making clear where he stood. "You're on my land," he said quietly. "You came through a blizzard to make a claim that has no legal standing. There's no judge in Montana Territory who would hear it." His voice had the particular quality of a man who has decided exactly what he will and won't do and is no longer negotiating about it. "You can turn those horses around and go back the way you came, or you can see what happens next. That's the only choice you've got." The two men behind Gideon were not comfortable. Lydia could see it. They were hired men, cold and tired, and they had not signed on for whatever this was becoming. One of them was already reining his horse sideways, the small, unconscious movement of a person who is reconsidering. Gideon stared at Sawyer. He stared at Lydia. She held his gaze and she did not look away, and she did not go small, and she felt standing there in the cold with the snow coming down around her, that something was happening that had nothing to do with this moment specifically, that this was the end of a very long thing, a thing that had started when she was a child and had been building toward this exact juncture for years. Her father's eyes. She did not look away. Gideon Holloway was not a man who responded well to being refused. She knew that better than she knew almost anything. But she also knew, watching him now, that what she was seeing in his face was not just anger. It was something less powerful than anger. It was a man realizing that the thing he had always relied on, the compliance of the person across from him, the automatic submission trained into her over years, was not going to be available to him today. She watched him understand that. She watched the calculation run through his eyes, the same quick arithmetic he always did. What he had, what he could use, what it was going to cost him, and she watched it come up short. "This isn't finished," he said. "It is for today," Sawyer said. Gideon pulled his horse around. The two men behind him went faster, already angled back down the track. He rode a few yards and stopped and turned back and looked at Lydia one more time, and she thought he might say something. One more thing, the way he always had. The parting shot. The thing that was supposed to follow her inside and stay with her for days. He didn't say anything. He turned the horse around and rode. She watched them until the snow swallowed them. Then the cold hit her all at once, the way it does when the adrenaline steps back, and her legs were not entirely steady. She put her hand on the porch railing and held it. Sawyer was beside her, not touching her. Just there, close enough. "You all right?" he asked. She thought about it. Her hands were shaking. Her face was frozen. Somewhere in her chest there was a tearing feeling, the kind that comes after something held for a very long time finally gives way. Not painful, exactly, but enormous. "I think so," she said. Then, "I've never done that before." Stood up to him? Said any of it out loud? She looked at her hands on the railing. "I've thought all of it 1,000 times. I've never... It's different saying it. It takes up more space." "You did well," he said. She almost pushed the words back. Old reflex. Deflect the compliment, discount it, wait for the catch. She stopped herself. "Thank you," she said instead. They stood on the porch together in the falling snow, and the mountain was very quiet after the storm, the particular quiet of a world that has been through something and come out the other side. And Lydia held the railing and felt the shaking in her hands slowly stop. She was still afraid. She would be afraid for a while yet. She knew her father well enough to know that today had not been a final ending so much as a shift. She had changed something in the equation, and he would need time to recalculate, and what he came up with next time was not yet known. But she had said it out loud. She had stood in the snow in front of the men he'd brought with him, and she had said the thing she had spent 22 years keeping behind her sternum, and the sky had not fallen, and she was still standing. That was something. That was, she thought, the beginning of something. She let go of the railing. She went inside. After a moment, Sawyer followed, and the door closed against the cold, and the snow kept falling, soft and indifferent and clean over everything it touched. The days after the blizzard had a particular quality to them, the kind of stillness that follows a storm not just in the weather, but in the people who lived through it together. Something had been said on that porch. Something had been witnessed. And now the ordinary life of the ranch continued around it, but nothing was quite in the same position it had been before. Lydia noticed it in small ways. She stopped calculating exits. It was not a conscious decision. More like she became aware one morning that she hadn't done it in several days, hadn't stood in a room and quietly mapped the distance to the door, hadn't tracked where Sawyer was in the house relative to where she was. She had been doing that since she arrived, the old survival habit, keeping geometry between herself and any man in the space. And then one day she noticed she'd stopped. She wasn't sure what to do with that noticing, so she just let it sit. The ranch work in the deep weeks of winter was different from the fall work. More contained, more repetitive. The range pulled in close by snow and cold. They fed the animals every morning in the dark, the two of them moving through the barn by lantern light, breath visible, the horses pressing their noses over the stall doors. They repaired things: harness leather, a cracked axle on the smaller wagon, the south door of the barn whose latch had indeed failed in the blizzard and had to be rehung in frozen weather with both of them cursing quietly at the hardware. They split wood. They checked the fences when the snow allowed and pulled back when it didn't. The evenings were long and close. The stove made the main room warm enough that they didn't need their coats, which felt like a luxury by November's standards. Lydia had found a box of books under the bed in the storage room. Not many, maybe 8 or 10, a mix of things: a surveying manual, 2 novels, something about medicinal plants of the Rocky Mountain region. She read in the evenings by the lamp while Sawyer did whatever needed doing at the table, sharpening tools, working leather, once spending an entire evening repairing the binding of one of the books with a careful patience that she found herself watching from the corner of her eye. "You like books?" she said one night. He looked up. "When I can get them." "Where'd you learn to read?" "Taught myself, mostly. I had a year of schooling before things went the way they went. After that," he turned the book over in his hands, "I'd pick them up when I could. Trading posts sometimes. Men I worked with would have one, and I'd read whatever they had." She thought about that. A boy on cattle drives, reading whatever he could get. "What kind do you like?" He thought about it. "True things," he said. "History. How things work. I like a story all right, but I like better when I feel like I've learned something at the end of it." "I'm the opposite," she said. "I read for the escape. The worse things were, the more I wanted to be somewhere else entirely." He nodded slowly, like he understood that without needing it explained. "What were things like?" he said, careful. "At the worst?" She kept her eyes on her book for a moment. This question would have closed her off 2 months ago. She could feel the old mechanism, the one that pulled the doors shut and bolted them, starting to engage. She let it engage halfway and then deliberately walked back from it. "There was a winter," she said, "when I was 16. He'd lost the cattle that fall, all of them, some kind of sickness. It went through the herd in 2 weeks. He'd borrowed against them, and—" She paused. "He came home one night, and I had made the wrong thing for supper. I don't even remember what it was. Something he didn't want. And he—" She stopped again, not because she couldn't say it, but because she was deciding how much. "He broke my arm." The room was very quiet. "He said I'd fallen," she said. "That's what we told the doctor in town. I fell." She looked up from the book. "The doctor knew. You could see he knew. He set the arm, and he gave me something for the pain, and he didn't say anything, and I understood that day what it meant when people look at something true and decide not to see it." Sawyer had put down the leather he was working. He was looking at her with the kind of attention that had no performance in it, no careful neutrality, just direct and full and present. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said. "I know you are. And I'm sorry the doctor—" "People don't want the trouble," she said. "I've made my peace with that." She looked back at her book, at the words that had stopped making sense. "The arm healed crooked, just slightly. You can't see it, but I can feel it when the weather changes, that winter." She closed the book over her finger. "I kept it closed in most weather. The arm, the memory." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You don't have to keep it closed here." She looked at him. "I'm just saying it," he said. "That's all." She held his gaze and she thought, here is a man who doesn't look away. Not from her history, not from the difficult parts, not from the things that were ugly. She had expected at some point to find the limit of his patience, the place where what she was and what she'd come from became too much, and he pulled back into himself. She kept waiting for it, and it kept not arriving. "You're hard to distrust," she said, "and I want you to know that is not a compliment I give easily." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. More the face of a man who has been working very hard at something and has just been told that it might be working. "I'll take it," he said. Agnes came twice a week through December, and by January she was staying for lunch as often as not, the three of them around the kitchen table with whatever Lydia had made or Agnes had brought. The conversation moving between ranch business and the state of Agnes's husband's claim up at the pass, and the 100 small things that make up a life in an isolated place. Agnes did not coddle Lydia. She argued with her about the best way to cure leather, corrected her flatly when she used the wrong knot on the fence wire, and told her once, with great specificity, that she was feeding the chickens too much and they were going to go off laying. Lydia argued back on all of it. That was the thing. With Agnes, she could argue, and Agnes respected that, and they'd arrive at some compromise, or one of them would turn out to be right, and the other would acknowledge it without drama, and that small friction was something Lydia hadn't known she needed. She had spent so long around people whose feelings she had to manage constantly that the simple luxury of saying, "I think you're wrong about that," without consequence felt almost illicit. She said as much to Sawyer one evening, not meaning to, and he laughed, really laughed, brief and genuine, and said Agnes would consider that the highest praise. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh like that. She found that she'd been listening for it, without knowing she was. February brought a cold snap that made the November blizzard seem mild by comparison. Temperatures that turned the air sharp enough to hurt your lungs if you breathed too deep, that made the horses reluctant to leave the barn and froze the water trough in under an hour of being broken. They got through it by staying close, by checking the animals more often than necessary, by keeping the fires going through the night in shifts. Lydia took the early morning shift because she was up anyway, the old habit of waking before dawn unbroken even now, and she would sit by the stove in the dark before the light came and listen to the frozen mountain and drink her coffee and feel, in those particular quiet hours, something she had not felt in years. She was trying to name it one morning when Sawyer came down the loft ladder earlier than usual and found her there, and she must have had something in her face because he poured his coffee and sat down and said, "What are you thinking about?" "Something I can't quite—" She turned the cup in her hands. "Do you know the feeling when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and then you put it down, and you can't quite trust that it's down? You keep reaching for it." He looked at her for a moment. "What did you put down?" "I don't know exactly. Being ready for things to go wrong, maybe?" She shook her head. "I keep waiting for the other shoe. Maybe there isn't one." "There's always been one." "Not always," he said. "Your life's not that long. You just had a particular run of it." She looked at him. "That's either very wise or very naive, and I haven't decided which." "Could be both." She turned back to the window. The sky outside was starting to get its first gray light, the mountain emerging from the dark in stages. "Sawyer." "Yeah." "Why haven't you—" She stopped, restarted. "You haven't pushed any of this. You've been patient in a way I don't entirely understand, and I want to— I'm not saying I want it to change, I'm asking why." He held his coffee and seemed to think about it with genuine seriousness, not reaching for an easy answer. "I think," he said slowly, "that I was afraid if I pushed anything, I'd find out I'd been wrong about you, about this. And I wasn't ready for that." She absorbed that. "So the patience wasn't entirely for my benefit?" "No," he said. "Not entirely." He met her eyes. "I told you my motives weren't clean." "There it is again," she said, and her voice had something in it that wasn't quite irony and wasn't quite warmth, but was somewhere in between. "There it is," he agreed. She looked at him for a long moment in the gray early light, this man with his scarred jaw and his worn hands and his 9-year-old list, this man who had built something in the mountains and waited for her to find her own way into it. "I think I want to try," she said. "I don't know how to say it better than that. I'm not promising anything because I don't think promises mean much yet. We don't know each other well enough for promises. But I think—" She stopped. "I want to find out what this is, properly. Not because I was sold here and have nowhere else to go. Because I want to." He was very still. "That's not nothing," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "It's not." He reached across the table and set his hand next to hers. Not on it, just beside it, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it. She turned her hand over and put it against his. They sat like that in the early light while the mountain came slowly visible outside, and the fire kept its small sounds in the stove, and it was not a grand moment in the sense that anyone watching would have noted it. It was two people with damaged histories sitting next to each other in the cold dark, choosing quietly to keep going. Spring came late and hard, the way it does in the mountains. March was still winter. April was a fight between winter and something that wanted to be warmer but kept losing. By the first week of May, the fight was mostly decided, and the valley below the ranch went through its change quickly. The brown going to green in what seemed like days, the aspen putting out their first tentative leaves, the creek coming up with snowmelt until it ran loud enough to hear from the porch. Lydia had been watching for the roses. They'd looked dead all winter, like bare brown canes, no sign of life, covered in their dead leaves that Agnes had told her to leave on for insulation, and she had. She checked them every morning with a thoroughness that she recognized as disproportionate and didn't care. One morning in the second week of May, she went out to look, and there were tiny red-green buds, no bigger than her thumbnail, pushing out from the canes. She went inside and said nothing about it. She kept it to herself for 3 days, going out to check each morning, watching the buds push further. On the fourth day, she went to find Sawyer in the barn. "The roses are coming in," she said. He looked up from the harness he was working on. Something in his face went quiet and open at the same time, the look she'd come to recognize as him feeling something he wasn't going to push on her. "Good," he said. "I want to learn to prune them, properly. Agnes said she'd show me in late winter, but then the cold snap—" "I'll find you a book," he said. "I know there's something in Billings." She nodded. Then she said, "I planted something." He put down the harness. "What?" "Along the east side of the kitchen garden. There was a patch of ground that wasn't doing anything. I put in some of the herb seeds from Agnes. She brought extra. And some of the vegetable starts." She looked at her hands. "I know I should have asked you. It's your land." "It's your kitchen," he said simply. She looked at him. "It's starting to feel like my kitchen." He said nothing, just watched her. "And my house," she said. "And my valley." She paused. "I wanted you to know that it's starting to feel that way." He stood up from the hay bale he'd been sitting on, and he came to stand in front of her, and he was not hurrying anything. She could see that. He was giving her every chance to step back, and she didn't step back. "Lydia," he said. "I know," she said. He put his hand against the side of her face, gentle and uncertain in the way of a man who is not accustomed to being certain he has the right to, and she leaned into it the smallest amount, just enough to answer the question. He kissed her once, briefly, with none of the confidence of a man who had bought and paid for something, and every careful tentativeness of a man who was asking. She put her hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat quick under her palm. When she stepped back, he let her go immediately. "Okay," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady, and she didn't mind that. "Okay," he said. She went back to the house with her hand still warm from his chest, and her heart doing something irregular that she decided not to examine too closely. Not yet. There was time. That was the thing she was learning, slowly, painfully, against every instinct she had. There was time. Not everything had to be resolved immediately. Not everything had to be braced for. Not every kind thing was the preface to something cruel. There was time. Agnes came for lunch that Friday and looked at the two of them across the kitchen table and said nothing for the entire meal, and then on her way out the door looked at Lydia and said, "There you are." "What?" Lydia said. "Nothing." Agnes pulled on her coat. "Just, there you are," and went out to her horse before Lydia could ask what she meant. She asked Sawyer later. He thought about it and said, "I think she means you look like yourself." Lydia considered that. "She doesn't know what I look like." "She knows what you looked like when you got here," he said, "and what you look like now." She turned that over. What she'd looked like when she arrived, tight and careful and watchful, a woman occupying as little space as possible, trying to be invisible in her own life. She didn't entirely know what she looked like now, but she was starting to take up more space. She noticed that. The way she moved through the house, less like a guest, less like someone on temporary permission. She left things where she used them. She moved the rocking chair to a better angle and didn't put it back. She hung her coat on the hook nearest the door instead of the one at the back. Small things, the kind of small things that mean something. One evening in late May, she was in the kitchen garden. Her kitchen garden now. She was working on accepting that, pulling the early weeds from between the herb rows when she heard a horse on the track. Her hands went still. Her first thought, automatic and fast, Gideon. She stood up and looked. It was a single rider, a man she didn't recognize, and she felt the tension go out of her shoulders an increment, but she stayed where she was until Sawyer came out of the barn and went to meet the man, and she watched the brief conversation, the papers that changed hands, the nod. When the rider left, Sawyer came across the yard to her. "What was that?" she asked. He held out the paper. "The deed transfer. The land's in both our names now. I had a lawyer in Billings draw it up." She looked at the paper. Her name, written in the careful formal language of a legal document, next to his. Sawyer Creed and Lydia Creed, joint title holders. She read it twice. The paper was warm from being in his coat. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know." "Sawyer." She looked up at him. "Why?" He met her eyes, steady and plain. "Because it's your home," he said. "And I want you to know that it's yours regardless of anything else, regardless of what happens between us or doesn't happen. This place," he looked out at the valley, the mountain, the garden with its rows of new green. "This is yours because you've earned it and because you belong here, not because I allow it." She held the deed paper and she felt something in her that she had no word for. Not gratitude, which was too simple. Not love, which was a word she still approached carefully. Something in between, something with a texture to it, built from months of ordinary days and hard work and honesty given and received. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her apron pocket and went back to her weeding. After a moment she heard him go back to the barn, and she listened to his footsteps cross the yard and the barn door open and close, and she put her hands back in the dirt and felt the late afternoon sun on her back, and the particular peace of a person who has, after a very long time, stopped waiting for the ground to give way beneath them. The roses bloomed in June. Not extravagantly. They were young bushes, not yet in their full strength, but they bloomed. 6 flowers on the middle bush, 3 on the one nearest the porch, a scattering of buds on the third that were still working themselves out. She cut one and put it in a jar on the kitchen table and didn't explain it, and Sawyer didn't ask, just looked at it when he came in for supper with that quiet, open expression he got when something caught him off guard in a way he didn't mind. She was learning his expressions the way she'd learned the fences and the horses, and the way the wind changed before weather, by living with them, by paying attention, by letting the knowledge accumulate without forcing it. She knew the difference between his tired and his troubled. She knew when he was working through something in his head and when he just wanted quiet. She knew that he slept badly when the weather was changing and that he made better coffee than she did, and that he had no patience at all for the one rooster who crowed at irregular hours but wouldn't get rid of him because the hens seemed attached. He was not a perfect man. He was sometimes closed off in ways she couldn't reach, sometimes pushed himself past useful into exhausted and refused to acknowledge it, sometimes held things back that he thought might worry her, and she had to pull them out of him with patience she didn't always feel. He had a temper that he kept on a short leash, but that she'd seen the edges of twice, both times directed at inanimate objects that deserved it, and she appreciated that he knew where to put it, but also knew it was there. She was not a perfect woman. She still sometimes went cold when he asked too many questions in a row. She still sometimes lay awake at night recalculating risks that no longer applied. She was slow to ask for things she needed and had to remind herself that asking wasn't weakness, and she had to remind herself of that more often than she liked. She held a grudge with a persistence that surprised even herself, and she had a sarcasm that came out when she was cornered that she didn't always mean. 2 imperfect people in a house on a mountain, learning each other slowly. That was what love looked like in practice, she was beginning to think. Not the arriving at some perfect place, but the ongoing work of it. The daily choice to show up honestly, to keep trying, to say the hard thing instead of the easy thing, to stay. She was choosing to stay. That was not a small thing. For a woman who had spent most of her life without the power to choose, the act of choosing was enormous, even when it looked ordinary from the outside, even when it looked like just a woman in a garden pulling weeds with the afternoon light on her back and the roses coming in on the south side of the porch. She was staying because she wanted to. That distinction mattered to her more than she could fully explain, and more she suspected than she would ever need to. It was enough to know it herself. Summer settled into the valley the way it does at altitude, not gradually but suddenly, as if the mountain had been holding it in reserve and finally decided to release it all at once. The mornings were still cool enough to need a jacket, but by midday the sun had real weight to it, and the valley below the ranch turned green in a way that made Lydia stop sometimes, in the middle of whatever she was doing, just to look. She was a different person than the one who had ridden up this mountain in September. She knew that. She could feel it in the way she moved through the house, the way she made decisions without rehearsing them first, the way she could sit in a room with Sawyer and simply be there without calculating how to be small enough not to cause a problem. She still had her habits, the early waking, the watchfulness, the way certain tones of voice could make something old and cold move through her chest. But they were becoming less automatic. She was catching herself before they ran all the way through. That was progress. It didn't look dramatic from the outside. It didn't feel dramatic from the inside either. It felt like work, slow and daily, the same kind of work she did in the garden, clearing things that didn't belong, making space for things that did, showing up when she didn't feel like it. She had learned something about that kind of work this year. She'd learned that healing isn't a moment. It's not the day you stand up to someone on a porch in the snow, though that mattered. It's not the first time you turn your hand over and choose to hold someone's. It's not any single thing. It's a direction, and some days you cover ground, and some days you stand still, and some days you slip back, and all of it counts. She was thinking about this in the kitchen garden one July morning when Agnes came up the path from where she'd tied her horse, earlier than usual, and something in her face made Lydia straighten up. "What is it?" Lydia asked. Agnes set down her basket. "I heard something in town yesterday. From Bill Mercer. He runs freight between here and Coldwater Bluff." Lydia waited. "Your father's lost the farm," Agnes said. "The bank took it last month. He's been staying at the Mercer place doing odd work, or trying to. Bill says he's not in good shape." She looked at Lydia steadily. "I thought you should know before you heard it another way." Lydia turned back to her garden. She pulled a weed that didn't need pulling, set it down, pulled another. Her hands kept moving while she worked through it. "Is he sick?" she asked. "Drinking," Agnes said. "More than before, Bill thinks." Lydia nodded slowly. She was surprised to find that what she felt was not satisfaction. She had expected somewhere in the back of herself that when her father finally hit the bottom of whatever he'd been falling toward, she would feel something like justice. She didn't. What she felt was more complicated and less satisfying than that. Something heavy and tired. The particular grief of a person mourning not what they had, but what should have been there and wasn't. She didn't say anything about it at supper. She sat across from Sawyer and ate and talked about ordinary things, the south fence, the state of the creek, whether the second hay cutting was going to come in before the next rain. And she watched him and thought about how in 9 months she had learned to read the quality of his silences, and his right now was patient. After the dishes, she sat at the table and said, "Agnes told me about my father." He set down the knife he'd been sharpening. "I heard the same from Whitmore at the post last week. Didn't know if you'd want to know." She looked at him. "You knew for a week." "I was waiting for the right time." "There isn't one," she said. "For things like that, there just isn't." "You're right." He said it without defensiveness. "I should have told you." She looked at the table for a moment. "I don't know what to do with it," she said. "He's my father. I know what he is. I know what he did, but he's—" She stopped. "He's a person who ran out of road, and I don't know how to feel nothing about that." "You're not supposed to feel nothing." "I want to," she said. "It would be easier." "Easier and right aren't the same thing," he said. "You know that better than most." She did know that. She had spent years trying to make herself feel less, because feeling things in her father's house had always been a liability. The want for nothing was just another version of going small. She was not going to do that anymore. "I think I need to see him," she said. Sawyer was quiet. "Not for his sake," she said quickly. "Or, not only, but there are things I didn't finish saying on that porch last winter. I said what I needed him to hear. I didn't say what I needed to say for myself." She looked up. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," he said. "You think I shouldn't." "I didn't say that." "Your face did." He almost smiled. "My face is worried," he said. "That's different from thinking you shouldn't. I'm worried about what it costs you, not whether it's right." He leaned forward. "Whatever you decide, I'll go with you or I'll stay here. Your call." She thought about it through the night. She lay in the bed that she had stopped thinking of as a temporary arrangement and stared at the ceiling and listened to the mountain and worked through it the way she worked through everything now. Honestly, without dressing it up into something cleaner than it was. She was not going for reconciliation. She knew that. Some things break in ways that don't mend, and the relationship between a father who broke his daughter's arm and told her to say she fell, and the daughter who had spent 2 decades surviving him, that was not a thing that was going to be repaired by one conversation, maybe not by any number of conversations. She had stopped believing in that particular story a long time ago, but she had something she needed to put down. She could feel it, the weight of it. Not the anger, she'd said the anger on the porch, and meant every word. Something underneath the anger. The part of her that was still, at some level, waiting for him to be something other than what he was. The child that keeps hoping. You can know something with your whole adult mind and still have the child in you reaching for it. She needed to put that down, not for him, for herself. She left for Coldwater Bluff with Sawyer on a Thursday in late July. 2 days' ride, the same road she had come up on 10 months ago in the other direction. The mountains looked different going down than coming up. The valley opening ahead instead of closing behind. The flat land spreading out as the elevation dropped. She had not been back since September, and she felt the difference in herself as the familiar landscape appeared. Smaller than she remembered. The distances shorter. They stayed at the boarding house in town. It was the same one she'd passed 100 times growing up and never been inside. The woman who ran it was named Mrs. Calver, wide and brisk, who looked at the two of them and said, "Creed, is it? I heard you married Holloway's girl," without any particular judgment in it, just statement of fact, and gave them a room with a window that faced the street. Lydia lay awake that night listening to Coldwater Bluff do its nighttime things. A dog barking somewhere, voices from the direction of the saloon, the creak of the boarding house settling in the heat. And she thought about the girl who had grown up in this town and how invisible she'd been. How many people had looked at the Holloway farm and looked away? How many people had known and said nothing, done nothing, because it was private family business, because it wasn't their place? Because the mechanisms that are supposed to protect people often have exceptions built in for the people who most need protection. She wasn't angry about it anymore. Or she was, but it was a different kind of angry. Not the hot kind that wants to burn things down, but the cold, clear kind that simply sees what is true and names it. The world had not been built to help her. She had built her own help, inch by inch, year by year, and then one day a man on a mountain had offered her a door, and she had chosen to walk through it, and here she was. She found Gideon at the Mercer place the next morning. He was in the yard, stacking fence posts with the slow, deliberate movements of a man being careful not to show how much effort ordinary things cost him. He had aged badly in the 10 months since she'd last seen him. Thinner, the skin of his face looser, the eyes she'd spent her whole life reading gone somehow smaller and farther back in his head. He looked like a man who had been arguing with himself for a long time and losing. He saw her and stopped. Sawyer had stayed at the boarding house without her having to ask. She had asked him that morning, and he had said, "I'll be here," and she had gone. She stood at the edge of the Mercer yard and looked at her father, and felt the full weight of everything she had carried her whole life. The fear and the grief and the love that had never had anywhere safe to go, the broken arm and the supper she'd cooked wrong, and all the years of calculating his mood before her own needs, all of it present in the air between them, all of it real, and all of it finally just hers. Not his. It had never really been his. It had always been hers, the carrying of it, and she could set it down whenever she decided to. She had decided. "Lydia," he said. His voice was different, not the voice she'd spent her life bracing against, smaller, older, stripped of whatever confidence had fueled its cruelty. "Father," she said. He set down the fence post he'd been holding. He didn't come toward her, and she didn't go toward him. "I heard you were doing well," he said. "I am." He nodded, looking at his hands. "Good," he said, and it had the quality of a man saying something he means in the only way still available to him, which is quietly and too late. She had rehearsed nothing. She stood in the Mercer yard in the July sun, and she said what was true. "I'm not here to punish you," she said. "I want to say that first. I'm not here to make you feel worse about things than you already do, and I don't want anything from you. I don't need an apology. I'm past the point where an apology changes anything. He looked at her. I'm here because I've been carrying something for 22 years, and I want to put it down in front of you so you can see me do it. She held his gaze. Her voice was steady. I spent most of my life believing that if I was good enough, careful enough, useful enough, you would see me. Not as a problem or a burden or a thing to be managed. Just as your daughter. She paused. I know now that wasn't ever going to happen. Not because of me. Because of what was broken in you. And I spent a long time being angry about that. And I spent a long time being sad about that. And I am done spending time on it. Gideon said nothing. His jaw moved. You are my father, and I will always carry that fact, she said.